Greetings, friends! Juan Ingrisky here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of February 9th through February 15th of 2026. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. And this week, we are going to go straight into the, well, kind of the Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia direction, but specifically based mostly in the Dnipropetrovsk area. And this is the area where and the reason we're starting here is because we are now getting more and more updates of the giant Ukrainian counteroffensive that started here. We have more and more clarifications that have come out throughout this week. Last week we talked about how it started, but it was only like a day or two into it, so we didn't really have much idea of what was going on. But this week we have a bit more clarifications. Now, one big thing about this is for the entire front, not just in this area around Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia, is that because of the communications issues with with Starlink shutting down, is that we're not getting as much information from the field, and that really sucks for someone like me who lives on the other side of the planet and basically gets all his sources from from Telegram and things like that from sources which are channels made by people who have a lot of times of sources on the ground. And now that there's no Starlink, it's very hard to get in touch with people getting, to get like raw info from the front line. So it's now getting a lot harder to know like what exactly is happening. I mean, is it really a slowdown? Is it like so it's very a lot of info that we use to make this type of videos is getting has been reduced. So we only we still have it's getting very vague. This war is getting more and more vague. It's getting a lot more harder to show who's who, who's where, who's and because the thing is that within like 10 to 15 kilometers of the front is just this giant no man's land. I mean, not no man's land, but it's like positions are intermixed. It's very fluid. It's just very hard to determine now about what's what. And the biggest thing is that the Ukrainians are doing this massive counteroffensive. And the thing is that, a lot of it is like, well, how much of it is just turning things back into the gray zone? How much of it has been where they've completely expelled the Russians? We don't know. And now the biggest thing is that there's two axes of these Ukrainian attacks. Well, three actually. Specifically in this area, it seems like what the Ukrainians want to do is attacked from the north, from Pokrovsky and Velika Milivkayevka, and then from Zaporizhia itself along these like line of big villages like Rizanivka, Vozadevki, Vershana, Tersy, and so forth. And then trying to break attack from this air direction as well. Now, the biggest, and we're going to talk about what exactly we're seeing here. So the biggest news is this kind of attack from the north here. Now, the thing is, the most important thing is that there is these two big villages of Berzova and Vashimia here. It goes kind of along this, kind of like some reservoirs and rivers here, and there's also some natural defenses here as well. So this red line is where the Russians are trying to hold the line, because if you kind of look down here in Berezova, and then in Vashana, and then we see Verba with these and all that. There's these are actually pretty decent sized villages, and this is where the Russians could hold up and put troops in. There's also there's a river here and some natural trenches. And the thing is that the Russians didn't go all the way up to the Volga River here. Yes, they took back Guy, Nova Alexandrivka, Alexivka, Aristopol, Stonsivka, but this area was more like a screening gray zone. And when, for example, if you looked at last week, it seemed like the Russians were up to the river here in Aristopol and Tika. But the big question, it wasn't like okay, they took over say Nova Alexandrivka and then set every single house has people in it. Maybe there was 2 or 3 observation posts, and the Ukrainians can bypass them. If they wanted to cross no man's land. Now we got our first geolocation of, I think it was like down here to the south of Sontsevka, where a Ukrainian vehicle was getting destroyed. And so now, a lot of sources are saying there's like this huge clash for what I call the Berezova-Vashana line, and the Russians really need to hold on to here. If they lose this area, this would be actually very bad news. Right now, what the Russians have lost a lot of decent-sized, a lot of villages, Alexivka, Nova Alexandrivka, Guy, or Stepol, Stonsivka. But these were kind of like screening observation post villages that kind of monitored, Ukrainians that were on the other side of the Volga River in Pokrovsky, Velika Milivkayevka, and were like observing them and acting as a screening buffer as the Russians pushed westward. However, the Ukrainians are doing a concerted counterattack and are have like pushed the Russians out of this gray zone, and now it's like the future of Zaporizhia and Kharkov is being decided in this area, in you know and in you know, not just here but also down here and in, you know, and so forth. So now the biggest question is if the Ukrainians could break through here. A lot of sources are saying, you know, they're breaking into Berezova, into Vishana, and so forth. But again, we have a lot. We only had like one video actually come out, and that actually showed some about like where the Ukrainians are, and that's it. We haven't had any more videos coming out. A lot of because of the Starlink problem. So it's a huge. There's an offensive going on, but we don't know exactly what's going on here. Some Russian sources are saying that they're starting to slow them down. It's just, you know, we probably need to wait probably for the rest of this month of February to figure out like what happens. You know, remember there's an offensive that happened in Kupyansk, and then that led to a lot of you know, that it was very bad for a while, and but then the Russians stopped it. There wasn't a complete collapse of the whole area, and yes, the Ukrainians gained back a lot of western Kupyansk, but I was worried they might destroy that entire bridgehead on the western bank of the Oskol. And so, you know, right now the Ukrainians are maybe pushing the Russians back from these villages, probably pushing them out of these villages in the south here. But you know, it's a very big you know, you know, but we shall see if they're able to actually do anything big from here. Like maybe because if they could reach the Berezova-Vishana line and, you know, secure themselves here, and then also with the Ukrainian offensive that's happening here, which let's talk about it for a second here because this is something that I want to talk about. Is that so? This time we basically got most mappers are saying the town to Ternavata, Kosovo, and also the Ukrainians like reached this river here, clear the Russians out of Prylukivka, and are like pushing, you know, trying to push the Russians back into the other side of the Gansha River. And actually, not only that, some pro-Ukrainian sources are saying, you know, the Ukrainians broke through here and took back Nova Zaporizhia, Dobropillya, and so forth. But most neutral and pro-Russian mappers are saying that it was, yes, they cleared most of the Russians out of the western bank of the river. Good for the Ukrainians, but the Russians are still holding on to positions on the other side of the Ganj, and that. But the thing is that Ukrainian DRGs can infiltrate this giant area, and they're like operating in these like fields, and they're trying to reach the town of like Rybny and Solotvka. And once you understand, like, you know, where the Ukrainians are trying to enter these villages to the north of Uspenivka, once you see what's happening here, you actually see how this comes into play here. If the Ukrainians could take Vishana, which is a very big village in this area, as I mentioned, the Russians have to defend here, and they're able to break through this area and reach here, this entire kind of section right here will automatically be encircled. Now the thing is, as you can see, you know, there's just a bunch of these small villages that are on the other side of the Gansha River in the north here. There's like Andriivka and Verdania, but again, these areas here serve as a sort of like screening thing, and I have no doubt that you know, what the Ukrainians are trying to liquidate this pocket here. So the ideal for the Ukrainians is to take back the Versova-Vishana line and then have something like this go on as well, so that they could have, you know, they can clear out this entire pocket here, and then from here they're going to continue pushing southwards, and, you know, probably the main goal here is to then, if they could do this as part one, I think this is part one of the Ukrainian offense, to take Berzova, Vishana, break through the, you know, the Russian defenses near Nova Zaporizhia, Dobropillya, and reach these northern villages here, and then cut off this area. So once the Ukrainians reach this red line, they're going to continue pushing south towards Glyapolya, and the Ukrainians will also push towards Uspenivka here. And what the Ukrainians are going to do is probably just, you know, secure their eastern flank here. I don't think they're going to continue pushing towards this area. They might just use it as a screening attempt to help take a bunch of these villages here so that they could push towards Uspenivka. And then the main goal here is probably just to retake everything that the Russians took in this in the Zaporizhia offensive. They want to cut off Glyapolya from the flank here. And to do that, they have to take Uspenivka. And so, kind of the big goal for, you know, and then, you know, obviously the main goal of any offensive is to break the enemy's will to resist, and then create a situation where you could break through here and basically surround and it destroyed the resistance here so that you could continue breaking through and take more. So obviously, the Ukrainians would love it if the Russians completely collapsed and they just broke through. And I mean, the Russians the same thing. It's just that at this moment is that you only could do offense. There's not this huge mechanized offensive. It's there's a lot of vehicles being used, but it's not like they're still being very cautious because of the drone threat. The same issues with the Russians being slow also apply to the Ukrainians in terms of trying to survive the drone threat. But that is what the Ukrainians are trying to do, and so I wouldn't doubt that with it. So it really depends. If the Russians could hold on to the Berezova-Vishana line, and if they could hold on and prevent the DRGs from from consolidating in this area, maybe the best for the Russians is that they're able to maybe hold on to this on the other side of the river here and hold on to but the thing is that I think the Russians are going to be kicked out of these villages to the north here, and probably the Ukrainians are, and so the main thing will be probably something like this, where this is what if the Russians could hold on to this at least they'll have the rivers, the reservoirs, some decent sized towns, and then from here they could grind down the Ukrainians trying to defeat them and then restart their offensive operations. The biggest thing is that they already actually still now the biggest loss would be their bridgehead on the other side of the Gansha River, which had the last fortifications for the Zaporizhia direction, and that's probably why they did their offensive here, is because they really didn't want the Russians were about to destroy this last fortification line before it was basically just there was no other. There's still fortifications behind that, but it's not like interconnected like a very strong, solid line of trenches, strong points, and so forth. But they're trying to build one. They're trying to build one along the Areka of Omelet, kind of like along this highway, and then they're also trying to build some around Zaporizhia city itself. So lots of this Ukrainian offensive is very troubling, but again, it's with that being said, it's definitely we still are it's still unfolding, and there's also a communication so. I'll definitely next week we'll see more and more about it, but until then, I'm going to wait until the end of February to see where this goes. So by the end of February, if the Russians are still in control, at the very least, of Berezova and Vishana, and at least still have their positions along the Gansha River, they're in a decent sized place, and the offensive would have been basically the only thing that would have brought about is just a step back for the Russians in terms of how do you say it? Yeah, basically just make it harder for them to do their offensive in the summertime. So we shall see how that develops. But yeah, so that's the kind of the biggest news, and probably why I'm talking so much about it, because not only that, we don't actually have that much to talk about throughout the rest of the front. Basically, the only thing I'm going to be talking about is this offensive, because everything else, there's not really even that much stuff. But yeah, this is the biggest news for this February, is the Ukrainian counteroffensive in Zaporizhia, and yeah, we shall see how that, where the Ukrainians will be from there. Now, a bit more to the south, this area around Gallipoli is actually where the Russians are making a lot of big progress. This week, the biggest news for the Russians is that they have completely captured the town of Zaporizhia and basically reached and took basically all the things up to this railroad line to the south of Gallipoli. Now the thing, and then also just today we had the ministry, or we had the group of forces east who is responsible for this direction, showing them raising their flags in the town of Tesovko here, and that there's actually a giant stronghold around the town of Krylichnia, which has not been taken yet apparently. But if they could take the stronghold, then the Russians will have a strong position here. Now the thing is that apparently the Ukrainians are also planning on trying to counterattack here, and they were trying to infiltrate into the southern part of Gallipoli, but they were destroyed. And the thing is that since the Russians have lost this kind of bridgehead that was developing in the north here, the Ukrainians could also attack from the south here, try to so the Russians who are creating a small bridgehead in Gallipoli, will have to be will be attacked from Verina Tersi, from Vosa and from the north here, and so they'll have to hold on to and so I wouldn't be surprised though if the Ukrainians retake Teslikovko. We talked about how there was a bunch of back and forth for Star Ukrainka. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians try to attack here. But for right now, the Russians are actually still pushing. They took Zaporizhia, very good news for the Russians. Took Teskovko. Now the thing is that when they take it, is that are they still taking it, or is it a just a flag raising operation? Now, it's not a completely just a flag raising operation. The thing is, you could enter it and then raise your flags, and then maybe there's only like a couple of like handful of you in this village, but that doesn't mean you could like withstand a determined assault. Maybe you could be knocked out by an assault. So it's not as consolidated as we think, and maybe there's still Ukrainian positions. Maybe there's like 3 Ukrainians in a basement. It's just a lot of things are interconnected, interwoven, and so it's very, very big news. Anyway, good news for the. So the Russians are making, around Gliopolya, they're making a lot of progress. But the thing is I think that they're going to stop here and just wait, because if they continue to push, maybe maybe they pushed over Varenka Teresi. That would have been the next goal. The thing is that with the Ukrainians pushing here and the Russians, not, they don't want to continue pushing if, like, for example, the Gliopolya, which is the where they're going to focus, gets overrun. If there is a worst case scenario for the Russians, then, they have to stop here and then, just have a screening force here and then redeploy troops to guard, let's say the Ukrainians take back Nova Zaporizhia, Dobropillya, they're going to be able to start pushing south and try to attack Gliopolya from the north here. So they'll have to redeploy forces to Rivnopolya, just to the northern Gliopolya area, and try to hold off any Ukrainians that are attacking from here. This is what, so, I do think that, if the Ukrainians don't open up another offensive vector here to try to attack the Russians here, at the very least, the Ukrainians' attacks in the northern Dnipropetrovsk area will force the Russians in Gliopolya probably to stop and to protect their flanks a little bit. So we shall see how that develops. And then in the kind of actually more in the traditional Zaporizhia, there's actually another place where the Ukrainians are actually on the counterattack as well. It looks like, they put up all their cards. They saw the same thing we were saying. We were talking about this before, but we talked about how, the Russians in this direction are moving, in a northeasterly direction to try to, reach this river that's here and try to cut this highway that connects Zaporizhia to Kharkov. The Russians in this area near Dnipropetrovsk, this is what I call the Zaporizhia-Dnipropetrovsk direction, are moving in this direction and try to cut this highway from Novomykolaiivka to Kharkov. And as you can see, there's a giant encirclement of Kharkov that was kind of developing. But as you can see, the Ukrainians saw the attacked in this direction. But they're also attacking here. We had a lot of mappers are saying that the battles for these villages that are to the are in this high ground here are being contested. And as I mentioned, this makes sense, because if the Russians take this, they'll have the high ground overlooking Kumanoshevaka, Yurivka, and they would have been able to put a very big squeeze on Kharkov. So that's why they're actually activating here. A lot of sources are saying they have taken, they kicked the Russians out of Novoklavovka, and the Russians are back in Pavlovka and Leukemia. But not only that, the Ukrainians are battling for Leukemia as well and trying to push so there's clashes going on from this village right here. Along with this, the Ukrainians are trying to push the Russians in this direction and basically kick the Russians out of northern Primorska. But again, Primorska has always been very much a very fluid gray zone here. Not a gray zone, but like the northern part especially has been very sparse, because this was recent gains captured by the Russians. So the Ukrainians were using their defenses here to try to re-enter northern Primorska here, and so only the southern part is left. So probably the main goal for the Ukrainians here is to retake Stepanhursk and retake these these trenches the Russians have been trying to take. And so if they could take back Stepanhursk, then they'll be in a very good position here to stop this western enveloping situation that's happening around Kharkov. But again, the Ukrainians have not. They're making progress here, but they have not achieved it just yet. But again, we're still trying to wait to see what's happening. I think next week we'll get a more better position. If the Ukrainians are making more progress and they're not being stopped, then we could definitely start. But if like next week we barely see the front move, then we could basically say that the Ukrainians are having a very bad time in terms of I don't think they'll achieve as much. But we probably have to wait this month. By the end of this month, we'll know like kind of what the Zaporizhia offensive would have achieved. There's obviously my guess is that in general these attacks will be a tactical gain for the Ukrainians in the sense of that when the Russians restart their offensive, they just basically gave them more breathing room to be able to withstand the Russian assault here. Anyway, so yeah, we shall see how that develops. So that's the Zaporizhia Dnipropetrovsk direction. I know this took a long time to discuss because this is actually where all the action's happening. There's barely any action anywhere else. Also, along with this, we actually had a geolocation of the Russians being in the southern part of Nova Andreevka. Looks like they sent a unit here to disembark to enter these. The thing is that I think these attacks to Nova Dnipropetrovsk, Nova Andreevka are suicidal. They send a person that they send a truck there. They dismount 5 or 6 people. They hide in the. The thing is, these are just villages, and a lot of them are destroyed to the ground. So the Ukrainians know where they're hiding, and then they'll just bomb the handful of troops they disembark here. So I do think, at the very least, Nova Dnipropetrovsk, Nova Andreevka are probably more gray zone areas because it's very hard for the Russians to dismount troops in this area. So I don't think there's Russian positions in Nova Andreevka, Nova Dnipropetrovsk, but maybe, who knows, maybe there's some Russian presence, but it's not consolidated, but who knows. So lots and lots of things happening in this direction, and basically it's just a matter to see where the Ukraine's, the fate of Zaporizhia and Kharkov is being decided. So we shall see how that develops. Alright, now we're actually going to go to the Kostyantynivka direction. You might be wondering, well, Kostyantynivka, not Dobropillya? Yes, because this entire Dobropillya area, nothing happened. Yeah, legit. I mean, we've had no info coming in. Yes, battles are still going on for around Belitska, near Grishny, and so forth, around, and so forth. But there's actually been no really confirmed changes. Now, in Kostyantynivka, I do have some confirmed changes, so we'll be talking about this week, and this is actually where the Russians are still making some good gains in Kostyantynivka. Now, the biggest news is actually, again, coming in the more western part of Kostyantynivka, is we had two geolocations. We had one geolocation of the Russians operating up in this reservoir to the north of Berostok right here, and then we had another geolocation of some Russians operating in this kind of residential area in the north, in the southwestern part of Kostyantynivka here. And this makes sense. We for the longest time we've had the Russians operating in Linivka. They announced they took Berostok 2 weeks ago, and so it does seem like the Russians are now focusing their efforts and trying to clear this residential area that's right here. This also again moves in tandem with the Russians already took the northwestern part of it, or the north. No, it would be the northeastern part of it, right? Yeah, the northeast, or yeah, because it's in the northern part. Anyway, it's hard. Anyway, my sense of direction is all out of whack at the moment. But in any case, this kind of this area right here of Kostyantynivka has been under Russian control for a little while now, and they're still expanding it. For example, this week, the biggest changes are happening in, they're trying to take over this kind of garden community, and some sources are saying there's DRG activity happening here. Now, I mentioned this ever since Покrovsk, is that, again, anything about the front line is very fluid. Again, it's very you got Russian people there, but just because there's Russian soldiers there does not mean it's consolidated. Now, same thing for the Ukrainians. A lot of people try to make this point, but then they don't apply it to their own side. I apply it to all sides as I try to. And, so just, maps are very misleading in this war. There's take the front line, and then where the front line generally is, and then 10 kilometers in each direction is this very big kill zone where, and just because there's a difference between a consolidated, solidified, strong area where it's 100% under one control, and then as you get closer to the front line, maybe it's 80%. The thing is, it's not it's extremely intermixed 50-50 and then 100% if you go back a few kilometers. No, it's yes, the front line is there's intermixed, it's intermingled, there's people on top of each other. One house could have one troop, could have a Russian, another house could have a Ukrainian. But, if you're okay, maybe that's the front line, but if you go back a little bit, maybe it's 100%. But the thing is, that's not the case. Now the further back you go, obviously, for example, if we look in, there's no Ukrainians in Bakhmut, for example. This entire area, this is just Russians holding on here. Now, if you go to Chasiv Yar, yeah, there's probably 100%. If you go back here, the Russians are mostly in control of. Yeah, I haven't seen this in a while. Google Maps has been updated, and this entire place was razed to the ground, man. Remember, this was a giant citadel, and now it's completely destroyed. Any case. But anyway, the Russians being active in this area, right? There's probably mostly Russian control here, but as you go here, it's starting to be more fluid. So these suburbs around Chasiv Yar might be, mostly under Russian control, but there's Ukrainians are able to still infiltrate these suburbs. Now, same thing here. It's not just like, okay, the solidified Ukrainian positions here. You could have Russian DRGs active in these kind of small villages on the western part of Chasiv Yar, for example, but maybe it's under mostly Ukrainian control, but it's so like if you go further back towards say Alexo Driskovka or Drisovka is just under 100% Ukrainian control. There's no Russians operating in Driskovka, for example. But as you get closer here, maybe it's mostly under Russian Ukrainian control. But you could have Russian DRGs active in Vrika, Lubovka, and Stinky, and so forth. So it's not like, okay, maybe like right here is just a very fluid, and then it's 100% if you go a little bit back. But no, it's like it does lean one way or the other. Maybe in Chasiv itself, it's mostly under Russian control, and these villages to the north of Kostyantynivka is mostly under Ukrainian control. But that doesn't mean you can't have Ukrainians or Russians operating in these kind of positions. And also, when you take something, it's also a matter of consolidation. You could enter it, but that doesn't mean you actually have. And then you can maybe even take it. Maybe there's no really big Ukrainian resistance there anymore. But that doesn't mean you've consolidated. As we see in the Zaporizhia Dnipropetrovsk direction, you could be kicked out pretty easily from places that are very much more of like an observation area. Anyway. But in any case, the Russians are now breaking into, they've taken Stepanovka, they're active in Ilinovka, the Berostok, and not only that, they're entering this area right here. The main goal probably is to take this area right here. As you can see, this is mostly just residential area, so it's pretty easy to try to take it here. It will be also easy because everything to the north of this river here is being cleared by the Russians already. So I do think that the Russians have a good chance of taking like this kind of part of Kostyantynivka here. Now this built-up high-rise area right here is going to be more harder to take, and this is and everything. But again, the Russians are slowly but surely getting themselves deeper and deeper into Kostyantynivka here. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Lyman and Slavyansk directions. And again, in Slavyansk, nothing's changed, actually. Still battles to try to consolidate in Makivka, Glubovka, and Prilivya. Same thing, the Russians are continuously trying to clear the northern part of Nikiforivka. The Russians are, after taking Zakitna, they're trying to push towards Krylovka, but they have to just clear more and more about a bunch of hills on the way there, but nothing's actually basically changed. Same thing, kind of in the Dobropillya area. Now, in the Lyman area, we actually had some changes here. Not that much, but still some things. The biggest thing is that we had a geolocation of the Russians being in the eastern part of Dobropillya here and right here. So it does show the Russians are infiltrating here, and they're really trying to break the Ukrainian resistance here. Because if Dobropillya falls, it'll be very bad news for Ukrainians trying to defend Lyman. So looks like, and not only that. We had another geolocation of the Russians expanding their presence in the northeastern part of Lyman right here. We had geolocation of the Russians active in this kind of residential area right here. So it does look like the Russians are probably trying to consolidate in this residential area around the Lyman Lake and just put more and more troops here, and then just more as they do that. Just as, for example, they're going to start trying to put troops in the southern part of Lyman, they're also trying to break into the northern part here, because most of these fields, it looks like, are being cleared from Ukrainian troops. But again, it's like a gray zone. Maybe, the Russians probably are only able to move from Toretsk and Zaporizhia, but that doesn't mean that these fields around Lyman, which they say is under Russian control, is every single field is with Russian soldiers. It's probably just a giant gray zone, and the Russians have to walk from positions in the Zaporizhia River towards Lyman, in a no man's land. But yeah, there's no Ukrainian resistance in front of Lyman, so the Russians are able to run the gauntlet through these fields and enter Lyman. They're able to, protect themselves from drones. But in any case, I do think the battle for Lyman is going to come to the end soon. But they're just slowly but surely, just having to supply it across the river is just being very bad for the Ukrainians to hold on to Lyman. And then in the Kupyansk, Kharkov, Sumy area, also not a lot has changed. The main thing in the Kupyansk direction is just more and more of there's just this again. This is besides now the Zaporizhia Dnipropetrovsk direction. Kupyansk also is very fluid. It's like one of those fluid areas of the front line, especially. I mean, not only in the western part, which we're talking about, but also in the eastern part. It seems like right now, for most mappers, is that the Russians are consolidating in Petropavlovka and Pashana, like along this railroad here. But not only that, we actually had even pro-Ukrainian mappers said that there's like DRG activity in Kiva-Sarovka and so forth. But there's so much big DRG activity. There's just a lot of fluid things happening here, and so probably the same thing for the Ukrainians here. So we've had a lot. Actually, had geolocations. The Russians being in Podolya, Krylyevka, but this is where like I think a big part about same thing. What happens is Russian command sends DRGs to enter, like say Kupyansk or these villages. They enter it, and there's not really that much strong Ukrainian resistance because most Ukrainian defenses are being done by drones now because of the lack of infantry. And so then because they don't get any sort of resistance, they just announce they take it. But that doesn't mean it's very consolidated and that you can't it's very and so forth. So, but again, there's nothing that much changes. It's just we had. Most mappers are saying that Pashana is being more consolidated, along with Petropavlovka, and so forth. But the main thing is that the Ukrainians are still holding on to Kupyansk, Volsoloya, and so forth, and this kind of like southern area. So they still have a strong position here. But it's Ukraine. This is very fluid, and it's just nothing's really changing. And then Kupyansk itself, we're still seeing huge clashes, especially around this kind of northern area right here in the northern part. It seems like this is where the Russians are held up still, and like kind of held up in basements, and the Ukrainians really need to try to kick them out here. So we saw, like for example, Ukrainians attacking, doing a clearing operation of some high-rise building in this area of some Russians here. So there's still a huge urban battle for the western part of Kupyansk. There's been no changes in the Kharkov direction. The main thing is that the Ukrainians are still trying to do counterattacks. We had a counterattack of the Ukrainians trying to enter Vilcha before it was destroyed, or at least the vehicle that was trying to attack Vilcha was destroyed. But we were able to dismount Ukrainians in Vilcha. We had the Russians in the southern parts of Dnipropetrovsk, but they still have not announced that they took Kharkov yet. But again, it's just nothing much changes here. Nothing much in the Sumy direction too. We had more clarification that the Russians are in Grabovska and Prorovka, but we already announced they took those two villages. But besides those two border towns, there's not been that much changes in the Sumy direction. The only big thing is that there was like some small counterattack the Russians were doing, along this kind of highway here towards the town of like Kostyantynivka, like this area, kind of in this general area. But they were attacked and destroyed, so it does look like the Russians are trying to maybe expand their foothold around the fields here, but that's basically it. Alrighty, that's it for this video. I know that there wasn't that much changes this week because of the Starlink issue. Also, the weather is still bad for the snow, and also but most of it is this Ukrainian counterattack. So that's all that was happening. Hope you guys enjoyed, but just keep coming back every week. It's always something special that's going on. Something new happens in this war. So if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian career updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. Comment your thoughts. Share this video around. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. And aim high and wander on.